You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
What lies beyond the source wall? We're going to find out today on our episode of Systematic Geekology, because we are the priest of the geeks, and we're going to be discussing the DC universe and its cosmology, from the creation of the DC universe as in its own world, all the way down to the Greek gods and the new gods and everything else in there. And by we, I mean, of course, not just me, Christian Ashley, but our special guest here, Kevin Schaefer. How you doing, Kevin?
Christian, doing great. Thanks for having me on. This is now, I forget what number episodes this has been on the show, but I love doing it. Good friend of Will Rose. I'm a writer and podcaster here in North Carolina and big in the NC Comic-Con scene. I'm a big DC fan, so excited to talk about all this.
Excellent. So, Kevin, what have you been geeking out on recently?
Well, I'll do one in a minute that ties very much in this episode, but first, one I'm reading right now that partly I picked it up because Mark Bagley is going to be at GalaxyCon, and Ultimate, my local comic shop, had a big display of books by creators that will be there at the show. And so one I picked up, I had seen this a while ago, but I didn't really know what it was exactly. And have you heard of Spider-Man Life Story by Chip Zdarsky and Mark Bagley?
I love Zdarsky.
Yes,
if there was anyone I wish was writing that main book right now, it'd be him. But unfortunately, we live in a world where Wells exists.
Oh, yes. I don't even want to get into that, but
we have better things to talk about.
Really, oh, yes. But you're totally right. I would love for him to have a full Spider-Man run. But for listeners who don't know, Spider-Man Life Story is a 6-issue series that covers the entirety of Peter Parker's life. But the idea is that instead of the traditional comics continuity where, Peter Parker and so many other legacy characters basically stay the same age for an eternity. He doesn't look any different now in 2023 than he did in the 60s. What this book does is what it would be like if we cover kind of the events of Spider-Man's life and do it in an actual chronological order and have him age and have him get on. And so each issue is a decade. So so the first one takes place in the 60s and 70s and so on. And so it does sort of an alternate take on the events of Spider-Man's life, but while still bringing in familiarity. And it's one you don't have to be versed in the Spider-Man mythology to enjoy. And I think if you are, it adds a really fun layer to it. But even if you're just sort of a casual fan, it's a really great book. And the art by Mark Bagley is phenomenal. The writing is just superb. And if you look at Zdarsky's writing, you might expect this book to be more funny and zippy, and it's not that at all. It's very much a hard character look. And I mean, just, the first issue is Peter questioning whether he should go to Vietnam or not, and Flash is going over there, and then it does the death of Gwen Stacy, and then he's Mary Jane, all these events. But what's really cool is, again, you're seeing it play out in real time, so you actually see this full what it would be like if Peter Parker was aged normally and wasn't rebooted every few years or anything like that, and it basically in a sense without traditional comic stuff, it has just a full linear story, and as a result you also see the other characters villains and other superheroes age, and it's just, I am loving it. I read the first half of it last night. I'm gonna finish it up tonight, but it is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend. Just the art and writing are perfectly in sync with each other, and it really is one I think I'll be thinking about for a while after, because again, it's just that kind of I like that kind of gritty take, and something that's really nuanced. So loving that. And then one briefly to tie into this episode, that I only found out about the other day when I talked about on a previous episode that I'm watching my Adventures with Superman, which I highly recommend. And while I was watching that, an ad popped up on Max, said, DC Superpower, the DC story. I'm like, what is this? This is a 3-hour documentary series about the history of DC, particularly when it comes to creators. Highly recommend. Again, it's called Superpowered, the DC story, and it's a 3-episode docuseries on Max.
All right. Excellent choice. Well, you mentioned mine briefly, what I've been geeking out on recently, and that would be my Adventures with Superman.
So good.
And As a reimagining, I really like it. Like, it's not trying to be the original. Like, they've made that sure. It's like, hey, we're having our own universe separate from if we were trying to do, like, say what Superman the animated series did instead, or the original comics, as it were. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. Latest episode I just saw with Lois, like 4 episodes in, almost figuring out. We don't know for sure.
Right.
Probably she's figured out that Clark is Superman, and they've shared their feelings with each other. Now, is she going to feel betrayed, or what happens there? I'm so in for that. If you're not watching that, guys, go out and watch it. It's very genuine. And me too. I love all the anime references they're doing as well. We've got some Dragon Ball stuff. We have basically Parasite was almost like Unit 1 from Evangelion. And man, I'm loving that show so far.
It's fantastic. I mean, I also touched on it briefly on a previous episode, and yeah, it's definitely a heavy anime influence. I really like that Clark, Lois, and Jimmy are like college age interns at the Daily Planet. So they're but I also too love that Lois is like, it's already touching on that, but in a really smart way. And yeah, it doesn't give it definitively like, is she going to definitively find out, or is she just guessing? And is he going to try to like spin the narrative and make her think otherwise? We'll see. But no, I am thoroughly loving that show as well.
All right. Well, let's get into the meat of the issue here. And that, of course, is our cosmology for the DC universe as a whole. Now, before we get into that, though, Kevin, what was your introduction to DC? Was it a cartoon? Was it reading the comics? What have you?
So I think I told this multiple times on different podcasts and panels and whatnot. But being born in 93, I grew up on Batman the Animated Series and all of the subsequent shows that evolved from that. So Justice League Unlimited, Static Shock, Batman Beyond. That was very much my introduction, and I could not have asked for a better one, really, because that is just like, I mean, if you want to talk about a prime example of like the best of the DC universe and the best stories, the best animation, the best voice acting, all of those shows are just fantastic. And so that was very much my gateway into the DC universe. And then from there, I had read some comics here and there, but really the book that did it for me was Batman Long Halloween, which I read in middle school. And that set me on a trail of reading all of the big Batman graphic novels. Probably read Year One and Dark Knight Returns when I was too young. But, my parents just saw Batman. They didn't really look to see the content in there.
How could they know?
Exactly. So by the time The Dark Knight came out, I had read some of the big heavy hitters like that. And so Batman was always my favorite. I was consuming his stories avidly. But then that also led me to like Watchmen and Superman for All Seasons and All-Star Superman. And again, all of the big ones for a while. And then later on, really jumping into a lot more stories. And I was also the perfect age for when New 52 came out because I was a senior in high school. And prior to then, I hadn't collected comics in regular issues because like I didn't have money to. So I would just I would just get trades here and there. But that was a perfect jumping on point. And so the first like regular series I was collecting was like Jeff Johns' Justice League, Snyder's Batman, Green Lantern, etc. A lot of those. So New 52 was a great. I know it has like all kinds of opinions from people, like anything in the DC universe, but but for me, I have very fond memories of it, and there are some great stories that came out of that reboot. And then so I was collecting that Dark Odds, and then that led into Rebirth, and then many others. And so I've touched on a lot of different DC. Both in the movies, shows, comics, all over the spectrum. But I especially love the animated series. I love, of course, Christopher Reeve movies, the Michael Keaton one, Batman, and of course, Dark Knight trilogy. All of that. And Arrowverse was also a big point for me, like throughout college and after. I was really invested in that for a while. And I've now actually been rewatching Arrow because it's been so long. And also, I'm planning on meeting Stephen Amell at GalaxyCon, so I'm looking forward to that. And so that's been really fun to revisit. So DC, I definitely have a long-standing history with, and I've been able to touch on all different areas of it in different media.
Yeah, for me, I've always been more of a Marvel guy, but at that same time growing up, I'm a 90 baby, and like 90, not 90s. And I grew up watching Spider-Man the animated series, X-Men the animated series, Batman the animated series, Superman the animated series. Then from there, growing up, and like you said, Justice League Unlimited, Batman Beyond, Static Shock, and then into Teen Titans. And it's when I got there that I actually, because I had read several Marvel comics at that point, because like Spider-Man is my number one. That's why he's my avatar. Yeah. So I'd read some of his stuff, Marvel Team Up, all that. But like reading that made me go, oh, my dad was telling me, oh, well, this is kind of inspired by the Wolfman Perez run. You want to read that? And my dad is a big comic collector. So I went through his long boxes and I read through the entire New Teen Titans for the first time. And I've been hooked on DC in comic form ever since. So obviously I knew nothing about what we're about to talk, just dipping my toes into DC at that point in time. But let's start where else but at the beginning, when the Presence created the universe. Now, the Presence is kind of, and once again, Kevin, feel free to like jump in whatever you want to in this conversation. It's getting my cosmology correct, because being in seminary right now, I really want to get my theology correct, even more than this. But for the purposes of this, the Presence is kind of like the Abrahamic God in the sense that he is creator of all things, and obviously DC has not always had Christian writers. So there are plenty of inspirations from Hinduism and Buddhist ideas and Shinto ideas and Taoist ideas, as well as Native American ideas about what God kind of represents there. So the Presence kind of encompasses a lot of that. Typically when people refer to him, he's got the kind of like the one above all in Marvel, in that he is Christian God, but they apply other things to him. And from there we get the Source, who is, if I remember correctly, the creator of the Source Wall, which surrounds every universe within the 52 realities, universes that encompass kind of like the DC multiverse.
Right. So a big thing, like 52 is a number you'll hear a lot throughout DC, and that's exactly like you said. There's 52 Earths, like alternate versions, and and the multiverse, like the concept of it in DC really dates back to, if I'm not mistaken, the first kind of idea of it is the Flash of Two Worlds, which was back in, I'd have to look at what year that book came out. I have read it. It's a great book, and you'll see that come across in the Flash TV show. But that paired up Barry Allen with Jay Garrick, and so there were these 52 realities, versions of Earth and the known universe that existed within the multiverse, and it ties back to the Source Wall.
That was the Flash 123 from September 1961.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. Yep, yeah.
And so we have the Source, we have the Presence. We also have kind of an antithesis and kind of an almost Gnostic sense of, God, demiurge, in the form of anti-life.
Right.
Now, obviously, those of us familiar with Darkseid, one of his big things is going after the anti-life equation. Now, depending on who's writing, the anti-life is actually a physical being that may have split off from the Presence or the Source, depending, once again, on who's writing. And Darkseid is seeking to use it to control things and make people complacent. And starting with Jack Kirby, kind of believed humanity kind of had it hidden within our souls or something like that. So that's there. Anything
there's
like that?
No, it's just like the anti-life. I like how you say it depends on kind of the creator and stuff like, but it is very much concept associated with Darkseid. He's always after the anti-life equation, but it has taken on different forms, and like anything in comics, there's like different eras, and there's gonna be reboots, and we'll probably get into that later. It's like DC is like, I love it, but it is they are notorious for reboots, and sometimes kind of just like, well, this was the thing back then, but actually we're going to change it completely. You know what I mean? So
that's
like,
comics.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
You have to, like you mentioned Zdarsky's life story earlier, like without a sliding time scale, you need something like that every now and then to pop up to change things.
Exactly. Yep.
All right. So next up, we have, as kind of an avatar of the Presence's wrath and vengeance, we have the Spectre and Eclipso. Now, Spectre showed up in the 40s as a superhero, like enacting judgment on people, and over time was developed into actually being like the avatar, like I said, of God's vengeance. And Eclipso was later retconned in the 90s, if I remember correctly, as being formerly the person before the Spectre who came in the form of God's wrath, who eventually became evil. So setting up the dichotomy of the two of them, like, how do you feel about that?
It does. So I don't know as much about Eclipso, but yeah, the Spectre is one that's fascinating. The book I really go back to a lot that will probably come up in this conversation more too is Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. The Spectre plays a prominent role in that. It's a great book, and I mean, talk about one that is filled with so many ideas and philosophical statements, religious context. And I mean, a character in that is actually based off Mark Waid's grandfather, I believe, who was a minister. And he's sort of like the point of view character in that book. But no, the Spectre I find really fascinating. Quick side note too, like Nicolas Cage, when he's ever he's asked which DC or Marvel character you play, he dodges the question and then eventually comes around to the Spectre. And he would prefer to play it in an animated series, but he has said that in interviews before, so just had to throw that in there. But
I would love that.
Oh my gosh, I think that would be perfect role for him. But yeah, but I like use it too. Like, it is a really fascinating dichotomy, and I think it provides this interesting lens because a lot of times with like the characters like this, you have all the big, heavy hitters like Superman and Batman playing out, and then there's this like, and they know all this multiverse stuff is going on, but then there's these like entities that are in the background, similar to how the Watcher plays out in the Marvel universe. So I'm always really fascinated by characters like this and how they play into these big epic narratives.
Yeah, I've always kind of been drawn to the Spectre as well, in that I love the idea of the character like manifesting as God's judgment and vengeance upon the earth. But at the same time, you have to right away to where he doesn't just curb stomp everyone he meets. That's not a very interesting story. As satisfying as it would be to like to see the Joker evaporated the instant the Spectre showed up, like you still want to have stories with the Joker in them. So
right.
Like, how does that happen? How can God allow certain, that gets into ethical questions. How can God allow evil to spread yet intervene here, but not there?
Exactly.
And handled with a very good writer, this is done really well. Sometimes it's done very poorly. And obviously some of those people have very poor theology themselves. I mean, that's not their fault necessarily. Just were raised in circumstances, not understanding other biblical concepts like other people would. But I've always found it very fascinating of like, God is directly intervening in this superhero world with the Spectre.
Yeah.
But where is he allowed to work? Where is he not allowed to work?
I also bring up a book real quick. Have you ever read 52, the series?
Yes.
Not the new, but 52. So for listeners, this was a series that was done after. So it takes place over an entire year. They had a team of writers and artists, like, so they could put out issues like every month and have 52 issues go out across like the entire year. And it was an entire year without the big trinity of Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. And it has all these other characters. And what I find really fascinating about the book, and the edition I have is in 4 trades, and it contains interviews and footnotes with like Dan Didio, Mark Waid, Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, all the like big creators of it. And one of the really interesting things is like Mark Waid and Grant Morrison talk about their perspectives, and like Mark Waid is a very like realistic, like just science only kind of like doesn't really have a grasp on which is interesting. He says that because he wrote Kingdom Come, but he likes to have like his stuff like more grounded like that. And then he said Grant Morrison is the one who comes in and makes everything wild and like will tackle these big like philosophical issues. He tends to go, or they go more into Middle Eastern philosophies and religions, but try to bring in nuances from different faiths into their writing. And that is just a really fascinating book to look at from that perspective.
Well, you mentioned Grant Morrison. He's responsible for our next topic of discussion, which is Zariel, the angel who joins the Justice League in his run that rebooted that in the late 90s. And this, for those of you who are unaware, like I was not either until I got one of those, what did they call them back in the day? They were the essential guide to the Justice League, like the essential guide to Spider-Man and Batman and all that. I think they were written in like the late 2000s at first.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. And like this was my introduction to him as a concept, having not read that run. And I did later read that run. A very great run, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but that's off topic.
No, I mean, well, I don't think you can do a topic like this without bringing up Grant Morrison. They're easily one of the most just brilliant comic book writers of all time, and they started with books like Animal Man, and Doom Patrol, and then they've written every big character of the DC universe. And again, they are really known for philosophical takes, and
Yes.
and really exploring the spirituality side of the DC universe and looking at it from different angles.
Yeah, I find it fascinating too. The only reason he exists is because Morrison wasn't allowed to use Hawkman at the time, because
Yeah.
he was going through that whole kerfluffle with all of his different origins, like contradicting one another. And we had just had Crisis like 10 years earlier, and that was supposed to fix all these mistakes. And yet writer after writer came in and said, oh, he's actually a space policeman. No, he's actually a reincarnated Egyptian. And no, he's actually Thanagarian, and all this stuff. It's like, nope, Hawkman's done. Until we can figure out someone who can fix him, you can't put him on Justice League. So he made Zariel instead. And for people who aren't aware of him, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but here we are. Speaking a word I've only ever seen written down. And his idea of Zariel is that he was an angel who was watching over humanity, fell in love with a woman, and gave up his power to be with her. Not all of it, but gave up a lot of his authority because he knew one of the angels he was working with was also about to fall, and just didn't want to deal with any of that mess at the time. So he ends up with her. A lot of bad circumstances happen with them. He ends up joining the Justice League. So I like the way they kind of play with the angelology. And I know that sounds stupid, but that's actually the name given to it over time.
Yeah.
But I find it fascinating, this whole concept of, because obviously in our biblical canon, we have fallen angels who once served God, but then we have, depending on how you interpret things, Satan getting them on his side and them falling. But could it be possible, even after that, for an angel to fall? Is it possible for an angel to develop feelings and for humans, something that is totally separate from him, and for God to allow him to lose his status as an angel to be on the earth? So that's why I really like looking at him. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, it is a fascinating question. And I mean, like that's something I hadn't thought about that. And I don't know. I mean, I think another book, if you want to really go into a lot of just crazy and philosophical ideas and stuff, is the Sandman, of course, from Vertigo. Because I mean, if you were like Neil Gaiman, also one of my favorite writers, but I mean, that book is everything from satire and looking at dreams and spirituality and all this stuff, but it's very much like, one of the big characters in that is Lucifer, and I find it a really interesting take on it. No, I think that's just a really interesting question to ask.
Yeah, that's one thing too. I'm not as familiar with the Sandman as I am with other stuff and that Neil Gaiman has done. That Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite writers. Man's very brilliant, but I've never read those runs, so I can't really speak on them that much. And also for time's sake, I didn't want to add everything else.
Oh, I know.
That cosmology as well kind of screws things up. And then you mentioned Crisis on Infinite Earths, so it's like, could I add the Monitor and Anti-Monitor here too? I could, but we'll be here for 2 hours.
I was about to say, I could go on and on about this stuff. So this is just I'm throwing out more recommendations to go deeper into some of those.
There you go. Yeah, getting ahead of the recommendations, always good.
Yeah.
So next up on the list I have are, of course, something you're very interested in and I'm interested in, that being the New Gods, as well as Apocalypse and Darkseid and all this. We mentioned Darkseid earlier, but where does it come from? You want to go through that?
So the New Gods, first off, my intro to them was in the animated series in Justice League, which is always fascinating that they bring up characters like that, because they never really have an opportunity to really go in deep on the mythology. But they did that, and then they have there's the animated movie Superman, Batman, Apocalypse. But anyway, the New Gods, so there are the planets Apocalypse and New Genesis. And New Genesis is like this heavenly realm overseen by Highfather. And then Apocalypse is the realm of Darkseid. It is this just hell planet where it's all suffering and violence and fire and decay. And one of the most fascinating parts of the New Gods mythology to me is that it's with Mr. Miracle, who is the son of Highfather, and then Orion is the son of Darkseid. But they are actually switched I don't know, I can't remember if it's right at birth or shortly after, but
for the sake of peace between two worlds, like one father raising the other son.
Exactly. So so Mr. Miracle is raised on Apocalypse, and then Orion is raised on New Genesis. And if you want a really amazing story, if you have not read that, you need to right away. Tom King and Mitch Garrett's Mr. Miracle run goes into depth on that, as far as like the introduction, covering all of that from the New Gods by Jack Kirby, and then tells a modern day story about Mr. Miracle. But anyway, so that's sort of the gist there. And again, there's like within Apocalypse and then within New Genesis, there's a bunch of characters on each one. And yeah, again, like you said, kind of hinted that Highfather and Darkseid are engaged in this long-standing war, and then at one point they come to peace talks, and that becomes the terms of their peace trade is that they exchange sons. And then eventually Darkseid is obsessed with the anti-life equation, which, as we talked about earlier, means different things depending on the creator, but he is definitely the more like satanic big bad of the DC universe, hell-bent on destroying worlds and ruling over everything, and has always just been this like terrifying figure in any media. And you also like, and for those who've seen like the Snyder Cut of Justice League, Steppenwolf is his top general, is his uncle. And yeah, and all of the mythology of the New Gods comes from Jack Kirby. It was what he came to DC with after he left Marvel. And there are aspects of it where it kind of originated with his Thor run, and it's sort of like what he did, develop New Gods to finish like stories that he didn't get to tell at Marvel. And so he brought that over and did this, create, and it had a very limited run back at that time. It was canceled pretty early, and then has been brought back here and there since then. But it is really fascinating. There was at one point going to be a New Gods movie by Ava DuVernay, and written by her and Tom King. That unfortunately got shelved, but I would really love to see that at some point. But feel free to add to that. I know I kind of went all over the place there, but
yeah. No, you're fine. If I remember correctly, too, at one point, Jack had gone to Stan and been like, hey, what if we did a kind of like a Ragnarok situation with Thor and had all of those gods die off, and we have these new gods be introduced instead? That'd be a wonderful concept. It'd be like, Earth has a history with these, but what if new ones showed up out of this apocalyptic situation?
Right.
And Stan wasn't into it. I would say ultimately for the best because of what Thor has done for the Marvel Universe, but like bringing it to DC was a masterstroke of genius. It introduced a lot of concepts. Like, out of all places in the world, where do you think Darkseid shows up in Jimmy Olsen's comic book? Not anywhere else. Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen.
That was about, like, when I was just doing some Wikipedia earlier too about the I forgot to mention that. They're like, that was the first issue they had their appearance in. And I'm like, wait, am I reading this right? But that is the fascinating thing about comics. And then what's really cool too is like, you're totally right. Is like, he had other Thor stuff that didn't get make it into his run, and then he had the falling out, left Marvel, did this at DC, eventually came back to Marvel, and he did Eternals, which is like ultimately like the New God version there. So it is fascinating how much back and forth there was, but the New Gods is just such a fascinating, very dense mythology, and some of his best work in terms of his art there especially. It was introduced in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and my first introduction was in the Justice League animated series. So like any of those characters.
Well, let's get into some more little G gods by going into the Greek gods, who of course are very important to the mythos and origin of Wonder Woman. You have the Greek gods like breathing life into clay that Hippolyta makes, to have a daughter, and imbuing different aspects of themselves, like some of what would come to Shazam, Captain Marvel as well. I hate that we can't say Captain Marvel now. I know like Marvel should have that title more, but I've always called him Captain Marvel, so that's just me being nitpicky.
It's hard, but no, I know it's hard, and there's a whole history there too. But
but for them, like, what do you think of how they're portrayed within DC and all that? And we'll get into the other questions I have in a bit.
I mean, I think the Greek gods fit perfectly into the DC universe because a lot of the mythology is based on them anyway. And with Wonder Woman, I mean, we've seen it in the movies and everything, and with the Amazon culture, a lot of that borrows from that mythology. So I like when you see actual ones show up there. I think it fits right in. Especially because I said this before, but like, Marvel is very much like ordinary humans becoming gods, and then DC is, but not always, but for a lot of it is like gods living among humans. And so to actually bring in actual Greek gods into that universe, I think it fits really well. And there's just such a correlation there.
Oh, absolutely. And like, honestly, if there is one pantheon out there, almost everyone at least knows something about it's Greek mythology.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then maybe Norse mythology would be next. And after that, it kind of gets like up in the wind of, where you're going to be looking for. Maybe Egyptian mythology, some people would know, but I wouldn't expect too much out of that.
Yeah.
But so like, it's the same thing like with what Stan and Jack did in Marvel with Thor. Like a lot of people, not everyone knew about the Norse gods, but most people knew enough. But for the Greek gods, like everyone pretty much knows.
Zeus,
who they are.
Hades, and yeah.
All right. So we mentioned this hodgepodge of all these different mythologies, and we have the presence and the specter and all that mess. Like, I asked this question for you, like someone who also writes as well, like how important is it for a shared universe to have its cosmology make sense? He said, asking about comics.
They ask about comics and asking about DC. Interesting question there, but honestly, it matters more to the individual story you're trying to tell, because like we said earlier, I mean, DC especially, there's jokes that it reboots like every few years, and that's not that's not entirely untrue. But like for instance, I go back to Kingdom Come, or I go back to the New God stuff. So if it has to make sense in the context of the story. So if you're basing it off a specific narrative or a specific mythology, you just have to have that all correlate. But there's no way you're going to make sense of the entire origins of the DC universe and the cosmology if you look at it as a whole, because there are changes. And over the year, I mean, something, for instance, Crisis on Infinite Earths, like I mentioned earlier, this was a big cataclysmic event by Wolfman and Perez in the 80s where they ended the multiverse because they wanted to consolidate everything into one universe instead, and they killed off major characters like Flash and Supergirl and any comic. I mean, I always wonder what it was like. I know people talk about it, like for fans of the time, like did any of them actually believe Barry Allen was going to stay dead, or or Supergirl? I'm sure it was heartbreaking at the time, but now it's just like it's hard to take any comic character's death seriously. But beyond that, they did that, and now here we are years later. The multiverse is back, and really a bigger concept than ever before. So again, as a whole, no, I don't need to make it to make complete sense, but more with the individual story you're trying to tell. I would say, you have to have like some linear thread there.
I'll agree with that. Bringing up the death thing just makes me think of what just happened to Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan.
Right.
And not even a month after, we have a new announcement. She's going to be in a new book, and she's going to be a mutant this time, guys, for the MCU synergy. It's like, can you not? If you're going to have this happen, it was handled so poorly to begin with, but you're going to do it well.
Do it well, and also like the writer who, I mean, you mentioned Wells earlier, but like the writer who killed her off, in a Spider-Man book of all places. He's also he's a co-screenwriter of the Marvels movie, which comes out in like November. So it's like, I mean, it was just it's just so pointless because like everyone knows you're going to revive her right away. And it was just kind of a cheap, senseless thing, So that's all. Yeah.
Yeah, but staying on topic, which I'm horrible at, so thanks for indulging me.
Don't worry, I go on tangents all the
time. For me, you would think it would be easy if you were alone to have your universes you create be consistent, but I forget things sometimes.
Sure.
If I don't reread a book that I've written and I start writing something and go, wait a minute, oh, I said this in the last book, I can't say this in the sequel. They're incompatible with each other, so I have to change things. So it's hard enough for me to do it on my own. But I also, one of my good friends, John, who also works with me in the Starving Writers Guild, he and I have a lot of shared crossover stuff. Like at this point in time, it's more hints towards each other's stuff. And eventually that's going to build up to other things along the way, hopefully. But to keep things consistent between the two of us is difficult because even with two people involved, you got to make sure things are tight. You got to make sure, well, this character was introduced here and not here. This character said this here and not here. So they can't refer to a conversation that hasn't happened yet, even with time travel. It kind of it messes things up.
Yeah.
So with a shared universe like DC and its cosmology, like obviously it's important to keep it as consistent as possible. But I try to show a little grace when you have hundreds upon hundreds of writers over since 1938 all the way to the present day. We're just shy of 100 years by a decade, a little over a decade. And like I said, just extend some grace their way. But that's what editors are for.
Right.
And if you have a really good editor, they'll spot something and they'll point it out. But also they have to deal with almost 100 years of history too. So you're going to forget things along the way.
That and things evolve and pretty good with DC and Marvel. I mean, yeah, like you said, you're dealing with that many decades of history. The story should take precedence over continuity. Meaning that, if you're so obsessed with this making sense and tying back to an issue that came out 30 years ago, but it interrupts the story you're trying to tell. I think the story you're trying to tell, and if that makes sense, that's more important because again, like we've said with comics, it's not a linear medium, as a whole. There's reboots and there's resets and everything. That's why I can't imagine working on an in-continuity book, because there is so much back as you have to. That's what I love about a story like Spider-Man Life Story, where it's this self-contained, really pivotal narrative that pulls from all the continuity, but does its own take and tells instead a grounded linear story. And that's what I like about DC a lot too, is they allow for alternate takes on stuff, and they have Black Label, and they have books that are self-contained where you just get to enjoy that story apart from any continuity.
Yeah, Elseworlds and all that.
Yes, exactly.
It's a perfect way of I had this idea, it doesn't fit in, but let's put it somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So we mentioned a lot of DC stuff, and you can add something we haven't brought to as well for this question. Is there any part of DC's wild and weird cosmology that particularly interests you, Kevin?
Kind of all the things I said, but there's also another story I wanted to mention too that you can find on. I've mentioned that I co-host the Wednesday Lounge podcast on the show before, which it's kind of on indefinite hiatus, but we did an episode a while ago on a book called Cosmic Odyssey, which Mike Mignola illustrated, and that is a fascinating book that really is just a fun one that kind of pulls in different characters and brings in some new gods, and it brings in Batman and members of the Justice League. I can't even off the top of my head really remember the narrative exactly, but I talk about it in depth on that episode. So I like ones like that merge aspects of the new gods with the main DC universe, and kind of all over. But I'm really fascinated with in different areas of all that. I like looking at the origins, how DC connects to different existing mythologies and kind of cultivates their own. So I really like kind of all over, but particularly new gods, particularly something like the Spectre. And then I know the Sandman does exist within the DC universe. I know people don't really think of it like that, but it is it's a Vertigo book that takes place within that universe, and there you see characters like Constantine, and we didn't even mention Constantine. I'll talk about another one. That,
if we can't even put him here.
Dark. Oh my god. Yeah, right.
We'd be here for hours. That's another one I deliberately didn't put on here. Not that we couldn't talk about him at all, but to me, a main focus of the conversation. We did a what if episode on what if Constantine became a professor at Hogwarts, and I had a lot of fun with that one. So if you want my feelings on him, go there.
I will check it out.
Yeah. So for me, obviously Constantine aside, because he's pretty dang cool.
Yep.
The Spectre, obviously, I'm very attracted to that idea for a character. Definitely coming from a Christian background of how does God display his vengeance on the world, and how is that different from his wrath? And that's why I kind of like the retcon about Eclipso being his wrath formerly. It's not always handled well, but the idea I like. But then we see the Spectre interacting with normal people in the day. And I like those stories too. I can't think of one off the top of my head for the life of me, but of him just intervening in nobody's life. But it means the world because God looks over that person just as much as he does for Batman or Superman.
Right.
or anyone else. I really enjoy how what their takes are for like a supreme being. Obviously, I'm coming from a very conservative way of looking at God and all that mess. And it's always very interesting to me to see someone who doesn't view him in the same lens, someone who would also claim him as their savior. Like that's so cool to me to see where they're coming from, but then also to see from a more secular background, like in comics, like you're not going there for your theology for the most part.
Right. But nonetheless, I think it gives you an empathy and a respect for different viewpoints and different backgrounds that helps us all understand each other better.
Absolutely. And there was one thing I wanted to talk about. I was trying to think, it was a specific story. It was that era of Shadow Pact, I think was the group's name.
Okay.
It was like a bunch of magic users in DC. This was like maybe the late 2000s, maybe early 2010s, if I remember correctly. And it's them fighting against a specter who's been kind of possessed and just trying to destroy magic because he sees magic as evil after being under the influence of something else. It's been so long since I read the story, but I really enjoyed their take there.
Okay, I'll check that out. I don't know that one, but I'll check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was right before the New 52.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up. Like I said, my DC knowledge only extends so far.
Sure.
Yeah, as much as I love this property, like there's some obvious like periods I don't know anything about.
Well, I mean, and there's so much to explore, and we're barely not even tapping scratching the surface with this episode, and same with the Marvel one. So,
yeah. I mean, how could you, with like we said before, decades long worth of comics and movies and spinoffs and all that? Yeah. So all that in mind, like what can we as Christians learn from how the DC universe is composed of these multiple different philosophies, mythologies, and religions held within its own universe?
Well, I think it goes back to the idea that, like, regardless of your background, a lot of us are asking the same questions and trying to understand it better. And I don't think any of us have all the answers, but we're all trying to thinking about these concepts, and whether it's someone who has no kind of religious or philosophical background or someone that does, there's this idea that we're all trying to understand each other and understand the world, and you can very much do that through fiction and through a big superhero universe like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a thought which I just shared with Kevin on our recording here. So if you want to know what that thought is, you can join us at Captivate, sending, I believe, even a one-time tip to see these special extra questions that we do for the audience. So just to heighten up your suspense there of what it could possibly be, head that way, and if you feel led to, send a little cash our way without hurting yourself. I will add that. So to answer this question here, at your point there, if we're all searching for those answers, and comics as a medium is somewhere we can do that. Who doesn't love an illustration of something I love reading, but I also love seeing something too. That's why I watch movies. That's why I read comics and manga and watch anime and all that stuff. In addition to reading, a 500 plus page book. It's because I love to see my thoughts poured onto the page from someone else who's thinking through the same things I am. And we see people exploring, Morrison, we mentioned him a couple times, his whole concept of hyper time and how that affects the multiverse as a whole. And his way of seeing Darkseid as this person who can seek after the anti-life, but what does he mean? What does that mean? What is anti-life compared to what we have? And you can argue whether or not the equation thing that he does come up with is a good thing. I think ultimately yes, because it's one of those things, if you're going to have an answer, make it as good as possible.
Yeah.
And Morrison, I think for the most part does. But yeah, that whole thing of where do we come from? Who should I look up to? Is there a God? And if there is a God, is he looking after me? Is he going to be like Zeus and going after every woman he can come across and all these terrible things, and yet I'm supposed to worship him? Or is he supposed to be this loving God? But at the same time, can that loving God allow evil to occur in the world? Can he allow the specter to be held back and prevent a war, even though terrible things are going to happen as a result of that war? Or a specter I mentioned earlier, can the specter kill the Joker? And wouldn't the world be better off if the Joker didn't exist? But well, sure, that sounds good to us, but God sees something a little higher than us. He sees a little beyond that. And I think one thing we can learn there, even from a secular writer, is that concept of we don't understand the totality of time, but God in this situation does.
I think that, and I just find like some of the biggest characters in the DC universe so compelling for that reason. And like, I mean, I just want to like dwell on the Superman notion for a minute of like, you know, the constant criticism of Superman is like, oh, he's so boring, he's so irrelevant, and all that. And like, I know this is gonna like, don't tweet at me here, but like, I am not. I'm not a fan of The Boys. I've tried multiple times, and I just
you got a fan right here,
okay,
my friend.
And the thing, it's weird because I do like a lot of darker superhero stories, but one of the things that bugs me about it is that it's so embraced today as this like, it's like, no, this is how Superman would be, and like, I'm like, okay, this is one take on it, but I get annoyed that people can't accept the idea of someone just being good for the sake of it. Not that he's not flawed and he's not going to make mistakes, but like people just can't accept that there's this character who, with power, he actually uses it well, and he actually can be a symbol of hope and justice, and he's trying to fight for the little guy and be this symbol. And that's what I love so much about My Adventures with Superman. That's just my 2 cents. I wish more people were watching My Adventures with Superman, and like as much as they were watching The Boys. But but that's just my take. But that's what I love about DC, and I love about universe is like you can have those themes exhibited by the big characters like that, and also explored in depth through New Gods and some of these lesser known entities.
Oh, yeah. Let me clarify. I mean, a fan of what Kevin said, not a fan of The Boys. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, a fan of The Boys. I love my superheroes. You can have your darker types. Like, sure. Speaking of that, like I don't care for the Authority.
Okay, yeah.
But I just read a story in Action Comics, which is the only thing I'm caught up with in DC that is running currently, where Superman brings the Authority to World. And his whole journey of being a good influence on them to protect people, and him fighting against Mongol in this senseless world of barbarians and just fighting and slaughtering each other. And the only way you gain something in life is to kill someone else, but Superman doesn't. And to see his effect on people there, that is the Superman I love. This altruistic person raised by Ma and Pa Kent to love others, to protect them. You're stronger than them. Don't rule that over them. Look after them because they need someone like you.
Yeah.
That's why I come to these comics.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know, sure, we could argue all day long. Like, there are plenty of people, if they got superpowers in this world, would act like Homelander or what have you. Right, sure, I know that for a fact. That's why I go to comics, for someone who does the right thing with those same powers.
Sure. And again, I do, I mean, I like a lot of like horror and indie and stuff like all this stuff, but it's just weird that that's just one. I don't want to say that just to be controversial, because I know a lot of people love that show, but it's just like, and there are a lot of good things about it, but I'm just like, I've struggled to get into it for that reason. It's just like, when it's like, the idea that it's just entirely cynical and everyone, and I'm like, yeah, I like there to be hope within superheroes. And again, you can still have conflicts within that. I mean, there are, probably one of the best is like Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' classic Green Lantern, Green Arrow run that observes like a conservative and liberal values add on with each other, and like, so you can still do all of that, and you can still have those themes explored. But yeah, you can also have characters that are inherently hopeful, and that's not a flaw, you know?
Yeah, and I know I speak for Kevin here too. Like, we're not bashing The Boys; it's just not for us.
Exactly, and that's the thing. A lot of people enjoy it. It's great. It's just like, but that's just the reason why I've tried a couple times and I haven't been able to get into it.
Yeah, I understand completely. Like, I want my Superman to be the big boy, blue Boy Scout. I want my Batman to be, the shadow in Gotham working in the night, but not also an unhinged lunatic who is one step away from murdering people.
Right.
Yeah, it's all good. But Kevin, is there anything else you want to add for our cosmology section here for DC?
No, this has been a really great discussion, and it's definitely one that, like, we could easily go on for hours and more recommendations, but hopefully listeners out there have gotten something out of it and come away with some recommendations too.
Yes. Well, speaking of, we've listed like 50 recommendations already.
Yeah, right. I know.
Do you want to go for another one?
Can I think of anything I haven't said? I mean, definitely watch.
It doesn't have to be about this. It could be anything else. Yeah.
Definitely watch My Adventures with Superman. See Barbie and Oppenheimer. I love both. Like, I did the Barbenheimer weekend this weekend, and two very different movies, but I'm a big proponent of the theatrical experience, and I love that. I don't know when this is going to happen again because of the actors and writers strike right now. But I do love that there are two movies that are original. Yes, one is based on technically an IP, and another is based on a historical figure, but nonetheless, like not big sequels, not big like franchise properties, but two like really original from two innovative filmmakers that really resonated with audiences. And I really enjoyed both, again, for different reasons. One, Barbie is very wildly entertaining and also has really brilliant commentary in there. And then Oppenheimer is a heavy philosophical character study, but it is brilliant. I think it's one of Christopher Nolan's best. So see both of those movies.
I think, sure, we'll go in that same vein. For those of you who are very interested in the history behind the research with the atomic bomb and how we came there, and the story behind some of Oppenheimer, and once again, this is for a more mature audience, I'll put it that way. No little kids listening to the last podcast on the left's coverage of the atomic bomb and its research, and the after effects it had on Japan as a whole, and how we tried to justify certain things. I speak this as someone who feels it was justified the first time around, and then the second time probably not as much. So you have opinions on those, let us know too as well. So thank you guys for listening in on this episode. If you have a chance, just leave us a 5-star review on your podcasting platform of choice. Just help us with the ratings and to find more people. Like we just had a meeting the other day where we are on track to have our highest new listener month ever. And you guys have been doing way beyond our wildest expectations, sharing the show with other people. We're highly appreciative of that. Keep doing that. Like, we're not here without you. So thank you for all the hard work you do and introducing the show to everyone else as well. And for listening and leaving us reviews, and let us know what you're geeking out on as well. Be sure to let us know on our Facebook group or Discord or YouTube. And if you have the goal as well to join us on Patreon or just help us out on Captivate, you can do that as well. But before all that, remember, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, be sure to check out the Anazao Ministries podcast network.